Yeah, today we celebrate moms. And hopefully you were able to find a little humor in some of the stuff that moms never say. I really like the one where she was driving the car. She said, would someone throw something at my head? That I thought was great. But probably my favorite one was when she said, I just spent 2 hours fixing dinner, but if you don't like it, I'll do something else. How many moms have ever said that? Okay. Wow. I really like creative ways that people come up with to help us remember how incredible our moms are, or in some cases were, because they're no longer alive. I know for some, Mother's Day is a tough day because maybe your mother has just recently died, or maybe you didn't even have a good relationship with your mother, and maybe she is still alive. And this focus today just brings about a lot of emotion, but not positive emotion. I can understand that maybe that's the case for some. But I hope, if that's the case, that you've had somebody else in your life, maybe a grandmother or an aunt or some other older woman who has been able to assume that role, that you can still celebrate today, okay, and thank God for all that she's meant to you. I also know that there are some who are listening who may have always wanted to be a mother, but never had that opportunity. And it stings a little bit when we talk about those who are mothers and celebrate them and all of that. And let me just say this, okay? God cherishes every one of you just as you are. And so do we. We just don't say that enough, do we? So I'm glad that we have Mother's Day at least once a year so that maybe it can help you oversee some of our negligence the other 364 days of the year. And maybe today, my biggest challenge or my biggest encouragement to all of you moms out there is just soak it in, okay? Soak in all of the appreciation, soak in all of the praise, and hopefully that'll be enough to fill your tank and you'll be able to get through another year. The question is, why are moms so special? Well, if we were to make a list, there'd probably be 100 things on that list, and sooner or later we would probably get to the one that says, because they were created in God's image. Well, we typically talk about God with masculine pronouns and attributes. I hope we don't get locked into thinking that God doesn't have characteristics that we typically see in women. I don't think God has, gender confusion. I think we may sometimes as we try to figure out who is this God. But we have to keep this in mind. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 says this. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. You've probably heard the phrase, Imago Dei. It means in the image of God. And it's from this verse that phrase is taken. And what it points out is that no matter who we are, as men or women, we bear the image of our Creator. At least for me, it seems that there are some parts of God, some attributes that women demonstrate and manifest better than men, and vice versa. There are strong moms out there who I think do an incredible job, even as a single parent, raising their kids. But you know what? Most of the single moms that I've talked to would love to have that other partner who can share those responsibilities and to give that love and support and model to their kids what a complete picture of God really looks like. We've been talking for the past 4 weeks about the side of God that we generally don't like to talk about, that being his wrath and his justice. And for some reason, over the years, those two traits at least have really become more masculine traits, haven't they? That's not to say that there aren't some women who are wrathful and full of justice. Okay, don't get me wrong there. But at the risk of sounding sexist, I think wrath and justice are primarily seen as male attributes. If you think about it, it's interesting because throughout the Bible, God is talked about with male pronouns, is he not? We talk about him being our Father in heaven. The most intimate prayer that we're even suggested of praying in the New Testament is that we call him Daddy, not Mommy. There's a reason for that, and I don't think it's because the early writers of the Bible and even God favors one gender over another. I think it's because we were all created in his image, and it has to do a lot with the divine order that the Apostle Paul talked about in the New Testament that drives out of or comes out of God's intelligent design for his creation. So if God's wrath and justice that we're reading about in the book of Amos is the side that we don't like to talk about, but we're talking about it, is there a way that we can look at that that will help us better understand who he really is? And in the meantime, get a bigger picture of our God. I think if we do that, what we're going to see is that there's a side of God that we do like to talk about. But we need to look at the side that we don't like to talk about so that we can fully understand how the other side comes into play. So to honor moms today, I want to focus on the love and grace of God because that's the side of God we like to see. And I see love and grace oftentimes more in women than I do in men. Before we dive into the good, fun topics, the sides of God that we like to talk about, let's just look at this ever-growing list that Amos presents for us of what the Israelites were doing that was causing God's anger and his wrath and his justice to come about. We've already been talking about how the Israelites were living a life of luxury. Many of them were living in luxurious homes, and they got there because they were using and misusing the vulnerable, abusing the poor, and even their worship services had become unacceptable to God. Today, what we're going to do is to just add to that list of things that made him want to bring about justice and demonstrate wrath. But I think we're going to figure out where the love and grace comes into. So hang with me. Amos chapter 8, verse 4, gives us more of the list of what God was upset about. This time, it had to do with their business practices. Listen. Hear this, you who trample the needy and do away with the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, or so that we may sell grain again, and the Sabbath be ended that we may market wheat? Skimping the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales. Buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. Once again, the dishonest business practices, which consisted of things like shorting customers of what they were paying for, using dishonest scales, adding worthless chaff to the wheat that they were trying to buy to just increase the price, and then jacking up the price, were things that were making God upset. But you know what? I think what was really upsetting him was the impact that those practices were having on the most vulnerable. What he said at the beginning of this was that basically what they were doing is human trafficking. And they were trampling on the poor so that they could enjoy the good things, the luxuries of life. I don't think you could read that passage that I read either without noticing that how it seems as though what they wanted to do was to get over with the religious stuff so they could get back to cheating people in their businesses. Do you see where it's talking about how when's the new moon's going to be over? When's the Sabbath going to be over with? It's almost like nowadays. People before Good Friday, why do we have to close on Thanksgiving? Let's just let us open and do business. Or the idea of, if Chick-fil-A had just been around back then so that they could see that they could still do really, really well as a business, even if they gave their employees a day off to spend with their families and to worship. But you see, the Israelites were more concerned about, hey, we've got to get back to cheating those who were vulnerable. These things just added to the long list that was already pushing God to the edge. He was ready to release his wrath and bring about perfect justice, but before he does so, we see the other side, the side of love and grace. Turn with me back to Amos chapter 7. And what we're going to see here are some visions that God gave to Amos, and two of them about how his anger was going to be restrained, by his mercy. Amos chapter 7 verse 1 says this. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me, Amos. He was preparing swarms of locusts after the king's share had been harvested and just as the second crop was coming up. Okay, isn't this supposed to be the year the locusts are coming back? Okay, so this is pretty relevant. Okay, verse 2. When they had stripped the land clean, I cried out, Sovereign Lord, forgive. How can Jacob survive? He's so small. So the Lord relented. This will not happen, the Lord said. Let's stop for a minute and just think about what happened here was like what the Apostle John was able to do in the New Testament. Amos had the ability to do in the Old Testament, where he was able to see into the future and to see what God was about to do. And it wasn't good news. In fact, God's wrath was going to be unleashed, whereby it was going to be horrid for the nation of Israel, to the point where it was going to be like a plague of locusts who would come in and pretty much annihilate the people of Israel. Note, though, when the vision said that the locusts were going to appear after the king's harvest. Why is that important? Was that just so the king could be more greedy and usurp more of the power? I don't think so. One scholar I read said this. You know what? In addition to feeding those who were at his table, he would also feed the armies. He would feed the other servants. He would also take in crops and take in supplies for the needy and the poor so that they could be helped. So you see, what God's saying here is that he's going to take care of those people. It's the people who are abusing them, the rich people, the people who have unfair business practices. They're the ones who are going to have a devastating year. When Amos saw this, he pleads with God and says, please, God, don't let it happen. In this particular case, he pleads with him to forgive them. But did you note? God doesn't forgive them. It just says that he relented from his plan. The Hebrew word there just suggests this. He gave them relief or comfort from a planned, undesirable course of action. God didn't forgive the Israelites for what they were doing. He just gave them relief in advance. He showed them mercy before it would take place. It's very similar to what we read about in Exodus chapter 32. Remember when Moses went up on the mountain and received the 10 commandments from God, and he comes back down off of the mountain, and what does he do? He finds all of Israel, what? Worshiping the golden calf. He gets upset. Moses gets upset, throws down the tablets, and then he has a conversation with God. Because God is furious. The fact that his people were worshiping these idols just had pushed him to the point where his wrath was ready to be released, and he just wanted to wipe out the Israelites once and for all. Look at Exodus chapter 32, verse 14. Then, after Moses pleaded, the Lord relented, same word, and did not bring on his people the disaster that he had threatened. So it wasn't unheard of. It was the same thing that he had done in Exodus, but here again he was doing it in Amos. The side of God that we don't like to talk about was ready to bring about this judgment day, primarily because the people were worshiping idols back in the book of Exodus. But before he wiped them out, okay, he held back that wrath. He showed them mercy. But then he gives Amos this other vision, okay? Chapter 7, verse 4 says this. Then this is what the sovereign Lord showed me. The sovereign Lord was calling for judgment by fire. It dried up the great deeps and devours the land. Then Amos cries out, Sovereign Lord, I beg you, stop. How can Jacob survive? He is so small. Again, so the Lord relented. This will not happen either, the sovereign Lord said. So he had locusts in the first vision. This time you have a vision of a consuming fire that was going to bring about this judgment. It was going to be so consuming that it was going to wipe all of the nation of Israel out. And so Amos begs God, please don't do it. Too many people, he's saying, in this small community are going to be punished, even those who aren't guilty of these social injustices that are being done. So once again, God heard Amos. And it says that he relented. He gave the people relief from that plan that would have just wiped them out. So you know what? That's the side of God I like talking about. I like the part that says, you know what? He was going to do this, but instead he did this. Do you like sharing that story a little better than the other? I hope. Because God is a just God, though, we can't ignore that. He can't let the behaviors go unpunished, so a third vision was given to Amos. Verse 7. This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing by a wall that had been built true to plumb, with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord asked me, "What do you see, Amos?" "A plumb line," I replied. Then the Lord said, "Look, I'm setting a plumb line among my people Israel. I will spare them no longer." What does that mean? I don't know if you've ever built a house or any structure for that matter. If you have, you know just how important it is that everything be square or plumb. Okay? This is a picture of when they were building our house last summer. I remember watching the framers as they were finishing up the first floor of the walls. They would go around and put their nails and their strings all around and hang the plumb lines. They called it racking the walls. And it was important that everything on the first floor, okay, be as perfectly square as possible before they started building on to the second floor. Because it makes sense, doesn't it? If the first floor isn't plumb, if it's not right, then the second floor is even going to be worse by the time they try to make it all come together. I think what God's saying here to Amos is, I've built this perfectly square and plumb house for you to live in. I've given you commandments, I've given you decrees, I've given you all of the direction that you need. And what he's saying to Amos is, you Israelites aren't living within the plumb walls. The walls are no longer plumb. You push them out. But you know what? God says, I'm dropping the line again. And from now on, those who aren't living righteous, straight lives will be punished. Some might say, well, Dave, how's that showing wrath? Or how's that showing mercy? That sounds like it's showing wrath to me. People are still going to be held accountable. There are going to be people who are going to have to suffer because of what the nation was doing. I don't know, and I thought about this a whole lot lately. I don't know for sure how God works it all out. But you know what? For those who live a life of justice and righteousness, a life like Amos talked about in chapter 5, verse 24, where it talks about being righteous and justice flowing like a river, I think those are the ones that God spared. Because if you look at what happened in Exodus chapter 32, there were thousands of people who were wiped out because of that worshiping the idol thing. If you look at what happened when Assyria comes in and takes over Israel, thousands of people died, but not everybody. So could it be that those who were living a righteous life, God protected them in some way and gave them the grace to live through what they were experiencing? That's what happened in the desert. Because once the Israelites got in the desert, what happened? God gave them everything they needed to survive. That's his grace in the midst of his wrath. I had an aha moment this week. I had those quite a bit when I stop and let God plant some seeds in my head. It's kind of how does God's love and grace, which I love to talk about, coincide and come together with his wrath and justice, which I don't like to talk about. Here it is. When we're a part of a group of people who have been or are currently not living according to God's plan, we as a nation, we as a group of people are living outside of the plumb line. We are not plumb. We are not straight. We're not where God wants us to be. And you know what? Let's say that we're part of a larger group of people who are guilty of social injustices, treating people the wrong way, and not administering the justice like we talked about last week. It doesn't mean that we're not going to be impacted when God unleashes his wrath on us. I think we are. But God's going to see us through it. It's going to be his love and his mercy. That's why in the midst of pointing out their grievances back in chapter 5, God offered the people of Israel the opportunity to seek him and live, even though his wrath and justice was going to be unleashed. And it was those who weren't willing to do so that were going to feel the full force of his wrath. As a part of the human race, we may have to endure things like local invasions, droughts, changes in our social structure. Why? We're part of a group of people who aren't living inside the plum house of God. I think one of the false claims that Christians hold on to nowadays is the one that says if we're living a righteous life, then we're not going to have any hardships in our life. Where in the world did Christians ever get that idea? Look at Jesus, the most and perfect human being on the face of the earth. And he experienced more unjust treatment, more unfair treatment. He was humiliated. Everything that happens to everybody in a negative way happened to Jesus. Every follower who wants to live like he did will not only experience a life filled with pain and sorrow. We've got to get that into our heads. I know many of you are saying, Dave, I already know this. Even though we're doing our best to live a faithful life, there's still going to be times when we're going to be hit with some pretty difficult things in life. You know that. You've experienced that. You're going to lose family members when it doesn't make any sense. You're going to suffer financial hardships. You're going to lose jobs. You're not going to get the jobs that you really want. People will tell lies about you, and people will believe them. We may even be made fun of as Christians for how we live. Where did we get the idea that being a Christian means that we'll never have to endure those things? All I know is what I read in the Old and New Testament where it says this: those who live a righteous life will suffer. But God gets them through it. In fact, it's through the suffering that we better understand that there's two sides of God. It's His love and His grace that gets us through His wrath. It's kind of like a mom who has to discipline her child for something. The child didn't live within the plumb lines that the parents had established for them, and the child misbehaves, and he has to be told, or she has to be told, that there were consequences for going outside the lines. I can remember on those very, very, very rare occasions when I was young and did something wrong. Just want to make sure you were still awake. And it was my mother who had to discipline me. That when I was crying and when I was hurting, what she would do is gather me in and hold me and tell me it'll be okay. In my mind, that's what it looks like. When we take the side of God that we don't like to talk about and understand that there's always going to be this love and grace that He's going to give to us, even as there is justice being given for all. There's no doubt in my mind that there will come a day when God is going to hold our nation accountable for how we've treated people. I think we're going to be held accountable for slavery in our country. I think there will be a time when we will be held accountable for killing millions of unborn children. I think there will come a time when the nation will be held accountable for the business practices where the poor have suffered so that the owners and the investors can become very wealthy. I think there will come a point in time when God will punish even the church for not worshiping Him, but worshiping idols. I don't know what that's going to look like. It may look like what happened to Israel. Okay, let's be honest. It may look like what happened to them. A godless nation may come into our country, and there's nothing we can do about it. What we're going to do as Christians is we're going to cry out, I didn't do those things. I'm innocent. Why am I having to endure the same thing as those people who did them. You know what? That's where God's loving grace comes in. There's a side of God that in the midst of his judgment and providing justice for all, that we really want to hold on to. The Bible refers to both men and women being created in God's image. Have you ever thought about why Mother's Day is a much more popular day than Father's Day? Could part of the reason be that moms demonstrate that side of God that we really like to talk about, the love and the grace? And oftentimes Dad is the one with wrath and justice. So we're going to want to celebrate Mother's Day a whole lot more. Doesn't mean that men aren't valuable. It just means we probably need to focus more on the side of God that we like to talk about. So moms, we celebrate you today. And my prayer is that as moms, no matter how old you are, that you hold us and remind us as God does what he has to do, that he's with us and he still loves us and that he gives us the grace to endure everything that's going to happen.